Introduce our two speakers today. Joan Biebelhausen, who will be sitting back in this chair momentarily, has served as the Executive Director of Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers since 2005. She's an attorney and is nationally recognized for her work in the lawyer assistance and diversity and inclusion realms. Joan has significant additional training in the areas of counseling, mental health, addiction, diversity, employment issues, and management. She has spent more than 2 decades working with lawyers, judges, and law students who are at crossroads because of mental illness and addiction concerns, as well as well-being, stress, and related issues. And we also have, to my left, Faith Amdahl, who graduated from Mitchell Hamlin in 1991. She was the marshal at the Supreme Court. She left that position to clerk in Washington County, worked in private practice, and then worked at Thomson Reuters for 7 years as a reference attorney and account manager. She was also an independent contractor for discovery on large class action lawsuits and opened up her own law firm in 2018, where she concentrates on estate and elder law. Faith has been active in advocating for suicide awareness after losing her brother Charlie in 2008. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. This is a hard topic we're going to talk about today. And what I'd like to do, for those of you who are watching remotely, and for those of you who are in this room, I'd like us to come together by doing a short breathing exercise so that we are present and that we know that we're going to be talking about a tough topic, but you're going to leave with some tools that you can use, as well as information. So I'd like you to just take a deep breath through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. This time, remember your 8th grade biology class and take it down to your diaphragm. Breathe in deep through your nose. And out through your mouth. And because they call it practicing law, we just practiced, now we're going to do it one more time. Breathe in slowly through your nose. And out through your mouth. This is an exercise that you can use whenever you're feeling the stress climb, whenever you're feeling distressed. Obviously, it's a very small thing. It doesn't take the place of friends or therapy or spiritual practices or teaching yourself things or whatever that may be, but sometimes it gives you that momentary respite when you're feeling distressed, and you can be present for what you need to pay attention to. So Faith, I am so glad you're joining with me, and I am so honored that you're willing to do so. You are talking to people about the tragic loss of your brother in a way that they will learn how to recognize, how to ask, and not to just walk away, not to ignore things hoping they'll get better. You are saving lives by doing this, and your brother's legacy lives on because of that.
Thank you.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you for asking me.
So we're going to start by just kind of giving you some information, laying some background. And maybe we'll use the mouse instead of this thing. I might need a little help with how I advance the slides.
Yeah, maybe pass me the mouse.
Sure.
I think we just need to make sure we're clipped into the right one.
All right.
There you go.
Okay, so it'll work going forward? All right, thanks. So here's what we're going to talk about. First of all, the amount of stigma around predictors for suicide, talking about suicide, dying by suicide, it's extreme. And in our profession, we have a credit requirement called elimination of bias. And I'm trying to think of something that's more important than our biases about people who are hurting so badly that dying seems like a reasonable option. And so we're going to talk about those biases, and we're going to talk about that stigma. We're going to talk about stress as a predictor, other issues in our profession. We're going to go through a protocol called Question, Persuade, Refer, QPR. You've heard of CPR. Well, this is QPR. We'll talk a little bit about ethics, because every CLE has to have one. And then we'll also talk about the resources that are available to you. And that includes not just for you, but if you're concerned about a client. We can talk with you if you're concerned about somebody else who might have issues. Do you want to do any kind of introductory remarks before we kind of kick it off?
I think Liz did a good job. I put together that little bio and it didn't sound right when I first did it, so I shortened it up. Thank you for asking me to be here, first of all. It's only taken 11 years. And you asked me shortly after my brother died, and I said, sure, I would love to do this and speak to people in person and educate them about the risk for suicide and what it's like to be a survivor. But doing it and saying that I'm going to do it are two different things. So it took me quite a long time to get ready. I've talked to people one-on-one or in small groups that I'm comfortable with, but this is actually the first time that I've been in a large room with real people here presenting. So it's too important to let it go. And it's ironic that we picked this date because this is actually World Suicide Awareness Day, which it's normally September 10th. It has been for the last few years, and this kicks off the National Suicide Awareness Week. So you'll see a lot of information, especially on social media, about this topic and a lot of other resources.
And LCL's Facebook page, my LinkedIn, and our Twitter feed has links to that information. And the materials that are posted for this program have information about upcoming suicide awareness walks. There are quite a few of them happening in Minnesota. One that starts at Como Park on Sunday. And then there are all the way into October all over the state of Minnesota. So if you're watching this from somewhere else, you can check out when the Wilmer Walk is, or when some of the other walks are, because there's opportunities for people to come together who would like to join with others who are concerned about this topic. So you'll find those materials linked to this program on the State Law Library website.
Joan, I'm walking this Sunday for Team Charlie's Angels to raise money for suicide awareness. So if anybody is interested, just let me know. I'll sign you up.
You're looking for sponsors too?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's talk about our profession. You know, we have a profession that people say that they're not happy with their work. And is that surprising, given that we are dealing with the worst things that happen to people, whether it's directly where we are with the client who has had a devastating loss, or whether we're dealing with it steps away where we're trying to make policy or work with other aspects of trying to make a difference in society with our law degrees. And when lawyers go and ask for counseling, a quarter of them say, I think I'm depressed, or I think I have an anxiety disorder. And sometimes people say, I need to deal with my stress. But what we've found in research that's been done, national study that was released in 2016, is that 20% of us drink in unhealthy ways. Doesn't mean everybody has to stop, but it means that we're using alcohol as a stress reliever, and it's a natural depressant. During our careers, 28% of us meet criteria for depression. 18% anxiety, and 23% at a level of stress that is considered debilitating at the time. And when asked the question, have you ever thought about suicide, 11.5% of us said yes. That's scary, because we have this, one author called it maladaptive perfectionism, where we think that if we're not absolutely perfect in unreasonable ways, then it's easier to, in the case of one lawyer who died at his own hand, it's easier for us to do that. So that's difficult. We rank 5th by occupation. People have asked me what the other 4 are, and I don't know, except that I know that dentists are there, and police officers. The incidence of suicide among law enforcement is unusually high. In fact, we're talking about that at the Criminal Justice Institute tomorrow. There are things that contribute to these issues. And I'll invite Faith to talk about some of these as well. We do a lot of our work alone. We think about lawyers, they're in court, they're making arguments, but when you think about the preparation you're doing, we're second guessing ourselves all the time, and we feel like we don't measure up, and so we're isolated, and yet we're supposed to know everything. And we feel that we've made, that we're deficient if we don't have absolutely everything. That we need to perform, we always need to be on, that we think and we're not supposed to feel, that we're looking for the worst that could possibly happen, because that's our jobs. And we're exposed to other people's trauma. And we're not supposed to talk about it, because a weakness in ourselves is a weakness in our case. A vulnerability in ourselves is a vulnerability in our case. That's stigma.
That's so true, Joan. My brother practiced alone, and I happened to be in his old office, which I thought would be pretty cool, to restart the business after 10 years. But he's in an office that I have office mates, but because everybody is so busy, you don't always see each other. And part of the allure of being in this office share was that he got to see other people who also practice criminal defense law like he did. And he might have somebody to go to lunch with, somebody to talk about strategy. And he was pretty social and gregarious. So he would walk around and he would ask people questions, and he'd ask for their opinions about strategy. He'd asked about their success on cases, and also found out what didn't work. But at the end of the day, he went home alone. He had several animals and he had tons and tons of friends, but his business was pretty much his own. And when times were good and the money was coming in and he could find the clients, it was wonderful. And then, you know, maybe after 6 or 8 months after he tried his cases, there was nothing coming in. So there would be months with no income, and then months when it was overflowing. He loved to travel. He'd save up his money to do that. But really, I think what happened is, as he went through his law practice, and what he related to my family and to me, was that it was increasingly difficult to continue to practice law alone. And in the months before he died, about 5 months before, he started talking to me, and he really said that he wanted to quit law practice. And I said I would help him do that. And he kept saying, "Dad will kill me." And I said, no, you won't. And he was just adamant that the shame and the fear and the guilt set in, because he'd been doing this for over 20 years. He was well thought of and respected. But he was also alone and felt like he really didn't have anybody to share that with. So he became more and more pessimistic, and looking back on it, I think he was very anguished about making that decision, and probably was depressed, undiagnosed, of course, and untreated, but it was a contributing factor, being alone.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I do want to say that if you do have questions or comments throughout this, we'll try and leave a little time at the end, but if there's something where you would like to say or ask something while we're talking, that's okay. So how severe is the problem? Well, there was a survey of student well-being, and by the way, there's Minnesota connections to a lot of these things. The study I cited earlier, Hazleton Betty Ford was involved in it, based in Center City. And this one, Professor Jerry Organ at the University of St. Thomas was involved in this survey of student well-being. And they looked at many, many different questions for law students. But they said that 1 in 5 replied that they had seriously thought about suicide at some time during their life. And they compared this with a Healthy Mind study, which was graduate students overall, and that number was at about 5%. So the question becomes, do people who are naturally, who are more likely to be depressed, go to law school? Well, research shows no, that the rate of depression before entering law school is lower, or is the same as average, but that it triples, even quintuples, while people are in law school. And so now they're in law school, and in the last 12 months, 6% have thought seriously about it. And 10% of those people have hurt themselves. And 17% of those people have hurt themselves more than once. So done something like cutting, like doing something dangerous. So this is something that is very serious in the legal profession for law students. The ABA Hazleton study that I mentioned earlier, where I gave the 11.5% figure, 2.9% reported self-injury, that they had actually done something that could be considered dangerous. And an actual attempt, just under 1%, 0.7%, had one or more attempts. Now that number, the thing about lawyers is we are perfectionists. And so the idea of making the decision to end your life and then not, quote unquote, succeeding is much more unlikely for us. People talk about, committing suicide, succeeding at suicide. That one's out there. Well, let's just say die by suicide. Let's think about our language. Committing is something that there is a school of thought that says, that's out there right now, that says that's the term we should use because it's something that's an affirmative act and that we choose to do it. The jury's out on that, but I'm choosing to say die by suicide. Anything you want to add to that?
I started saying that shortly after I lost my brother, Joan. People asked how he died, and I think I was so exasperated at one point that I said, why does it matter? Well, we discussed this yesterday. People want a connection. They want to know why. And people were saying, well, was it a car accident? Was it cancer? And I think when I finally had enough, I said to people, and they knew, after some time that it came out that he died by suicide. My parents didn't want that widely known, and I didn't have them around for a whole long time afterwards, so I wanted to honor their wishes, which was really hard because I'm trying to educate people and make them understand that this is a choice that people make. And when you make that decision to die by suicide, there isn't always something that you can do, especially if somebody has already made their plan. But oftentimes, if you reach them before an attempt and before that plan is made, you can get through to them. And it's one of the most easily preventable deaths. But to me, when I hear people say commit, that's like the R word or the N word, because it's shaming. And I say, would somebody commit a car accident? Would somebody commit cancer? No. The point is that he's dead. And when you choose to die by suicide, I mean, that's the end result that people want. And I don't think that there should be any more shaming involved with people like me who've survived this, and friends and family, because it doesn't help advance the issue that we all need to be aware of this and deal with it. It just puts people off. So I'm quick to, when people say commit suicide, especially in writing or face-to-face, I'm just quick to say that person died by suicide. So thank you for that.
I think it's important. Our language is important because anything that is shaming makes the person who's already distressed go down lower. And it is a preventable death, but sometimes there's nothing you can do. And if you ever reach out to someone and they still die, it's not your fault. And you need to remember that, because sometimes there's nothing you can do.
Joan, one of the hardest things I had to do was to tell my parents that their son had died. I got the call in the middle of the night from the coroner's office. So I saw it come up on caller ID, and I just assumed that maybe my dad had a heart attack. He was in the hospital and nobody could reach me. And it turned out that it was about my brother. So I made a plan to gather some people together to go over the next morning and tell my mom and dad. It was on a Saturday. And I tell you, that was the hardest day of my life. And I had to preface everything by saying, this is not your fault. And they didn't understand why I was saying it, but I did. And I think that helped. And it's something that at least my dad remembered in later years, that it wasn't his fault, even though he couldn't understand it.
Yeah. There's some theories about why people die by suicide. There's the escape theory, the hopelessness theory, and the interpersonal theory, okay? And so if we look at the legal profession, we have for the escape theory that we're not meeting our standards, even though our standards may be ridiculously high. And we start to blame ourselves. We have that perfectionism. And so we need to escape this absolute world of failure. The hopelessness theory is more like there's nothing I can do, there's nothing anyone can do, and then we start to see this ray of hope, that there is a way out of this. And in fact, people who start an antidepressant are at very high risk because they feel enough better to actually take action. And then we have the interpersonal theory, which is that I don't have a place, the isolation. I don't have anybody that is telling me I'm worth it. I don't have anybody, I am a burden. That's why the rate of suicide in people 65 and older is much higher. The rate of dying by suicide versus attempts is many times higher for older adults than for people who are younger. And sometimes it's people who can take a lot of pain. So do you want to comment on any of these? Because they are all present in our profession.
Well, we know that the rate of suicide among men who make attempts is much higher, especially because men choose more lethal means of suicide. So they have a greater chance of succeeding on a first attempt. Women, I think it takes an average of 7 attempts because women choose more passive means. I think from my brother's perspective and these different theories, I would say that he probably falls in the hopelessness theory. Mm-hmm. And in these conversations that I had with him, that I mentioned, he really felt like he would not have the life that he chose to have, that maybe he felt pushed into, and that there was nothing else that he could really do to contribute. And as far as I know, he wasn't depressed. One of the first questions that the coroner asked me was if my brother was depressed that I knew of, and I said no. And then he followed up and said, has he ever been treated for depression that you know of? Was he on any medications? And I said, no, not that I know of. I don't know that he ever received any psychiatric care. And there was a lot of stigma and shame in my family in particular over using antidepressants to deal with depression or any kind of mental illness. And I think that that was a contributing factor. So hopelessness, I think, is really where he was at, financially, socially, isolated, and actually very hidden from the rest of us in the late stages of alcoholism.
Mm-hmm. And that falls within all of these, where I am not able to stop.
Right.
And I want to, and I haven't been able to.
Yeah.
And the rate of suicide among people with substance use disorder is considerably higher than average, and the rate of suicide among people with compulsive gambling disorder is even higher than that, because someone with a compulsive gambling disorder, and I'm not associating this with Charlie at all, it's just a really important statistic that people who do treatment for problem gambling, you don't ask for help for a problem, for a gambling problem, until you have absolutely nothing left and no way to get it anymore. If you have a nickel, you can build that up. And when you can't get another nickel, that's when you have to tell people, and sometimes people walk another direction and take their lives. So let's talk about understanding this and some things about preventing it. We'll start with mental health. So just looking generally at our lives, you know, if things are going the way we would really like, we have a good balance between our personal and our professional lives, that our connections, how we are feeling, and our general sense of well-being, that they are balanced. And one of the really important things that makes such a difference to people is social connections. And you know, lawyers, we're in an adversarial system, and yet often we can be with someone where we're arguing something very strenuously and then go have coffee with them the next day. And that's the way our profession has always been. But in some work environments, solos who feel like they're in this silo and all of these other silos around them, as well as other organizations where you just do your work and then you leave. We don't always have those connections.
We don't. And a lot of people, they go out and they drink to celebrate. And I witnessed that firsthand. One of the people who Charlie worked with many years ago won a really big case and was already, you know, half in the bag, as they say, when I got there. And my brother probably was too. It was downtown Minneapolis, and I got out of there. And this was pretty much a regular event, because how else do you celebrate other than to go out and drink?
Yeah, that's what our profession does. And then there are the things we're feeling, you know, all of these emoticons that are, that can be part of what you're doing. There's a wide range of emotions there that can sometimes feel like they're out of control, but other times it's just all of these things we're seeing, and I don't see a whole lot of happiness there. I don't see a whole lot of satisfaction. There's always a little something wrong, and in a profession where we're always looking for something to go wrong, that's what we see. And so how do we cope? How do we deal with the stuff that comes to us every day, the things we're reading about, all of this trauma, all of these people facing their worst experiences? And to be able to build resilience and actively say, this is something that is challenging me, this is something that's difficult, I'd like to do something about it. One of the things that's out there is called, that came out after the study of lawyer depression and substance use, was something called the Path to Lawyer Wellbeing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, because it's like, well, you got to manage your stress, you got to build resilience, all of these other things. Well, what do you do? How do you do it? I don't have time for this. And we think if we don't know how to do it perfectly, we're not going to do it. And so the Path to Lawyer Wellbeing, which I'll talk a little bit more toward the end, has a toolkit with various things to help deal with the challenges we have. And LCL offers a group to work through some of those particular things that stress us. And we've been having it in our office, but we're moving it over to Minneapolis for the fall session to see how it goes. And it's going to be over at the Bar Association. It begins the first Monday in October. And I thought that was appropriate. It either is or will be on the LCL website. It's free, and there's also telephone access, but you have to let us know ahead of time so that we can send you the code and all of that. So we've got a counselor who's facilitating that. And so, yeah, we should handle things, and sometimes things are good. Like when things were positive financially for Charlie, who knows how things were going otherwise. But sometimes things go wrong, and our battery is just about depleted. You see that red line on the battery that we all are afraid that is going to be there. So what are some of the physical symptoms of the distress that could suggest that we are either heading toward depression, or we may have other issues, the kinds of things that can show us physically that we should really take a look at what's going on, because this is what we're doing. So our blood pressure might be too high. And it's interesting because I know that a number of people who watch this are working with judges, and you know, you think about the decision burden that the judges have. Maybe there's some judges as well. I have made it a kind of a habit of when a judge retires, it's like, I'm just curious, did your blood pressure meds change? And almost always I'll hear, well, yeah, actually, I am taking far less, or I'm not taking them anymore. These are symptoms of stress, and things that could be like a panic attack, anxiety attack, but we're just always just kind of tightened up. The headache might be rapid. We think that we have a heart issue when in fact we're having an anxiety reaction. And another physical thing is that we get sick more often. We get sick more. Things might not heal as fast. Some of the emotional and behavioral symptoms, you know, we talk about, have you lost pleasure in normally pleasurable activities, but lost interest in normally pleasurable activities, but kind of the three big ones are food, mood, and sleep. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? And how are you feeling? And then we may overreact to things. We might feel like what we're doing doesn't have a purpose. This is the kind of thing that can happen, for example, with returning service members, where they've been involved with something that is so intense, and then they come back to the kinds of things people are complaining about. And jump in if you want to say anything about these, but I'll give you a chance when I kind of finish this, this section too. And then what's going to happen is that we aren't getting around to doing things. We're not dealing with what we need to deal with. The idea of calling that client back and you know that you were supposed to get back to them last week, we start to not trust people. We become more irritable and we withdraw and isolate.
You know, one of the biggest complaints for ethics violations is lack of due diligence. When you talk about violations of the ethical rules 1.3 and 1.4, 1.6, it's really symptomatic of people who are having other issues, which Joan was just talking about, and it could be decreased motivation. You can't get into the office. One of the things that I learned about Charlie after his death, and as I shut down his office very suddenly, was that he hadn't been picking up his mail. And he had piles and piles of mail that were sitting on the couch in his office, and they were all bindered together. His files were in neat order, his desk was in order, but the people who worked in our office were actually calling him and asking him to come and pick this up and saying, is there something that you need us to look at? Do you need us to look at these notices from the courts, at these filings? And he kept saying, no, I'll get to it. And I know that he told me, and he told my mom and dad that he was just increasingly unable to get down there. He also had a condition in his leg where he went to Micronesia for the 2000 celebration, and he came back with what seemed like a case of chiggers in his leg that turned into some dread flesh-eating bacterial disease that never was able to be treated. And he became lame at the end. He walked with a cane. So it was physically very difficult for him to do all the things that he used to do, maybe riding a bike. He loved to ride his off-road bike down at the river and run his big yellow lab with him. And climb cliffs. And he loved to go fishing. And he had a boat. It was increasingly difficult for him to get his boat out on the river. So it was just a whole combination of things. And what he was interested in changed. Things that he used to enjoy, he wasn't able to anymore. And when he said that he would come over and visit, or he said he would go into the office, he just didn't show up. And people started to notice. I didn't notice a whole lot. There were a few events with the family that he missed, especially at the very end. But I didn't put two and two together. And I don't think that a lot of people put two and two together. And now I know that that's a big red flag, especially the mail. And when Joan and I were talking yesterday, I told her that when I first got into his house, we couldn't get in the door on the porch because it was so filled with mail for months and months. So starting sometime in August, he just didn't pick up the circulars, the papers, the bills, anything. He let it all sit on his porch, and he used the back door and just ignored it. Mm-hmm. So immediately I picked that up and knew that we should have been paying more attention to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's like, maybe I've heard this metaphor about, you take a kettle of water and some frogs jump into it, and you turn the heat on, and it gradually gets warm, and it does it so slowly that the frogs will cook. But if you have boiling water, the frogs aren't going to jump in, or if they do, they'll jump out right away as soon as they feel it. And what happens sometimes is you don't realize how hot that water is getting. And yet that person is at great risk, but it's just a little bit warmer than it was last week. And so sometimes you have to step back and say, okay, not what was different from last week, but what's different from a month ago or 6 months ago, right, when you're kind of wondering if somebody's okay.
Right. And he would make up excuses and say that he was sick, he had a lot of nosebleeds, whatever it is. He had a reason or he had an explanation for everything. And, if somebody that whether it's a client or a family member or friend, starts giving you stories and explanations that don't seem like who they used to be, please, confront them and ask them. And not in an aggressive way, but just say, is there something that I can do to help you?
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about a way to talk to people in a little bit. So just thinking about generally, are the symptoms you're experiencing or that you're watching somebody else interfering with your ability to work, play, or love? Those are kind of the things that really matter to us. And what is the frequency, intensity, and duration? Because we all have bad days. And the good thing about bad days is you appreciate the good days more. But if they're all bad days or they're all really never good, then that's a challenge as well. And these are some assessment tools that you can access yourself. The LCL, click on resources and you'll find more. But mental health screening is a very important site, and I would encourage people to take a look at that as a way to sort of like, I'm concerned about this person, so look at the assessment questions, and it's like, oh, they got 4 out of 5, you know, that tells you something.
2 out of 5 would probably tell you something.
Right, right. And one of the things that happens with both depression, we don't know if Charlie had that, but it does happen with substance use disorder, is that you deny there's a problem. And your brain says, you're okay, it's all right, people are just bugging you, they don't know what they're talking about, you can do what you want. Those are all challenges as well.
That's a really good point, Joan, because my brother had a disease that told him that it wasn't a disease. And he increasingly started telling us, probably in the year and a half before he died, especially when he would come over on a Sunday afternoon and, you know, sit in the sitting room up front and talk about his cases and, you know, talk about what was going on in his life with my parents and I. It was just kind of increasingly that everything was going wrong, or these people were after him, or he couldn't do something right, or a particular client was dissatisfied. He was really distressed, in particular when he would lose, not lose the case, but lose out on getting a client. And because of the nature of his business, he would chase people, you know, all the way from Iowa up to Duluth on a moment's notice, you know, to help them out, especially if they were in jail, and to try and secure their fee. So it was kind of that mentality of the world against me. Is what I heard a lot, and I think my parents heard, and it was really frustrating to hear that because we'd always have to like talk them up, and Dad would say, Charlie, you know that you can do this, and so it became very difficult at the end to hear this and feel helpless.
Yeah, and he wanted to not practice and felt that he didn't have that option.
Yeah, and he just didn't want to say it, of course.
Yeah. And that's why people do interventions when they recognize the issues, because the person would like help, but they don't know how to ask for it. So you mentioned that males die by suicide more often than women, and that sometimes peers can say something that is going to have even a bigger impact than the professionals. So let's talk about some risk factors and warning signs. And this is something that is from the American Association of Suicidology. They came up with this thing we can remember. And you're thinking about, you're walking this path, and it's kind of like the frogs in the hot water. Is the path warm? Is it getting hotter? And so these are some of the things to be aware of in thinking about whether you would be concerned about somebody. First of all, talking about it or thinking about it. What would somebody's method be? What might you do? How would you be found? Who would know? Are they using more substances? And by the way, if it's a stimulant type substance like cocaine or an action-based behavior like gambling, there's looking for action. And so the person who is using stimulants as opposed to depressants like alcohol is going to be doing things that are more dangerous. The path is someone feeling like they have less of a purpose. Is there additional anxiety? Do you feel like there's no way out, trapped, or feeling hopeless along with the purposelessness? And then as someone moves further toward actually thinking about and perhaps making a plan and getting ready to carry it out, they're going to withdraw. And their anger might increase because it should have been better. It's not fair. The kinds of things that you were hearing. and they will become reckless, and the mood might change. But the mood, as I mentioned earlier, might get better because they found a way out. These are some of the things that the American Association of Suicidology has mentioned. Do you want to talk about some? There's a handout that's posted that has additional risk factors, or has risk factors, and I wondered if you wanted to address that at all.
This handout that I found from the American Association of Suicidology is fairly clinical, but it goes into defining different risk factors and looking at the types of populations that these risk factors affect most often. So really, the first part of it, what they're perpetuating, is a lot of what we've talked about, being male, being older. When Charlie died, he was only 44, and he was actually in the lowest risk factor category back in 2008.
Although that has changed, hasn't it?
It's shifted, and so now we have people, he's actually, if he died at 44 now, he would be in the highest risk factor, which I think is from like 40 to 55. And that happened after the recession, job loss, transitioning, not being able to find work, losing a spouse, a divorce, all kinds of different things. So it has changed, and some of these are mentioned here, like early widowhood, separation or divorce. If you've had prior attempts, you're going to be at a higher risk. We've talked about most of this. Some of it has to deal with prior hospitalizations, a history of violent behavior, reckless behavior, and then you get into what they use for psychiatric disorders as well. So if you've been diagnosed, for example, with a mood disorder, schizophrenia, eating disorder, you're going to be at a higher risk for dying by suicide if you have those factors under your belt. They look at what they call major access 1, 2 is personality disorders, and 3 are medical disorders. That includes traumatic brain injury. I don't think it necessarily would have included my brother's staph infection in his leg, but pain disorder might be something. I saw on here today, when I glanced at this, exposure to another death by suicide.
Yes.
Copycats are huge. And one of the things
they found a way out.
Yes, and they've seen somebody else who was successful in doing it. One of my brother's friends came to me after he died, and he said he wanted his ashes and to scatter his ashes. A number of people wanted them, but very few people actually claimed them. And his friend Keith, who had been with him in college, said, Charlie is now the 5th person I've known in the last 2 years from college who's died by suicide. And shortly after I gave him the ashes, he called me and he said he'd lost another one. And he called me a year later and he said that there was another one. There were 7 people in 7 years that he lost. And he admitted to me that he was depressed. And it was very odd to me because it's almost like an admiration society. And I sat and talked with him and had a long coffee, and we just talked about how he could feel better about this and know that he didn't have to be personally influenced by that, and he could stay strong and be educated. There are different risks that they define in here too for a second category of suicidal behaviors. If you own a gun, for example, if you have enduring unemployment, if you have major stress, a lot of this we've already kind of discussed in the body of this. And then lastly, they talk about triggering stimulus. So you're going to be at a higher risk of dying by suicide if you've actually endured particular events. The one that I think that applies particularly to Charlie and trying to get out of his law practice and feeling unsuccessful is the shame, the guilt, the despair, the humiliation. I really think he felt humiliated, and that he would lose his face and his status in the community with his peers and also with our family. So that fits in there along with legal, other legal problems and financial vulnerability.
So there's a lot there. And sometimes there's something you can do about it. And so I'm going to take you through a protocol that is called question, persuade, refer. And there's a shorter version of reaching out to somebody you're concerned about that I want to go through too. which is just a simple set of questions where you start out by saying to the person, you know, this is our relationship. I care about you. You're someone who matters to me. And then you say, this is what I'm seeing. And you lay out data. If you say you always, they will think of a time they didn't. If you say you never, they will think of a time they did. And then you say how it makes you feel. Because they think it's just them and they don't think they're bothering anybody. This could be someone with a substance use disorder. It could be someone who doesn't have the energy to do anything with about their depression because they're depressed. And lawyers, you know, we can argue with anything, but I care, I see data, and I feel. It's kind of hard. Well, you shouldn't feel that way. Hey, I'm telling you how I feel. And by the way, this is probably the hardest conversation I've ever had in my life. But you're important and you're worth it. And then you listen to what they have to say. And sometimes that's when someone will open up and then you say, here's what I'd like you to do, and here's what I'll do to help you, so that they don't feel alone. I care, I see, I feel, listen, I want, and I will. So those are some things, that's just the very shorthand version of being able to talk to anybody. But let's talk about QPR. And it was developed by a doctor who was thinking, well, we have a way to start people's heart up again. How do we start their hope up again? And so he developed this protocol. It's not counseling or treatment, but it's meant to offer hope through positive action. So we talked about some of these myths already, and we'll kind of review some of them. No one can stop it, it's inevitable. Well, actually, sometimes people can. And sometimes someone begins a suicide and their brain will say, wait, I didn't want to do that. It's the person who's standing on, you know, who's rescued from something, who's able to stop whatever they're doing, because the brain floods with these emotions to say, no, I don't want to do that. And for someone who dies with a means that cannot be interrupted, that doesn't happen. You're going to make somebody angry, increase their risk. Well, no. If you can open up that line of communication, it's going to be better. Everybody can say something to someone to show that they care, and then sometimes have a greater impact. I'm just letting you jump in on anything you want to say.
No, I wanted to add, because I don't know where it is in here, but there's some statistics out there, and they may come from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's website. I'm trying to remember, but this is recent. People who want to die by suicide, if they're actually starting an attempt, oftentimes they will change their mind within 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. Think about that, half a minute. And when you mentioned, you know, being able to stop or wanting to come out of it, I'm thinking of the classic, the overdose with the pills, right? Mm-hmm. Get your stomach pumped, or you stop taking them, you say, you make that call for help because you all of a sudden you realize you don't want to die and it could be final. But that's an impulsive decision, 30 mm-hmm. seconds. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes, this is why people can change their mind very quickly about wanting to die. It doesn't mean that they won't make another attempt. It just means that the impulsivity is really what leads to death more often than not. I really think that that if my brother had not made the decision that he had, and if somebody had been there, if all of a sudden he got that inclination to stop, that he may not have died. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into what ifs. He was very determined that he was going to, but I think that he may have had those fleeting thoughts, you know, mm-hmm. for 30 seconds at a time.
Mm-hmm. And the article that is distributed here as well as online talks about a therapist who describes that point where she began her attempt and then wanted to come back. Sometimes the person who is suicidal can't see another way out. And sometimes it's impulsive, but sometimes the plan has been developed for a long, long time, and then, okay, now's the time. We've spoken with a man who says, the day I was going to take my life, this is the day. He made the decision. He had his plan, he was ready to do it, and his wife said, can you pick up? And it was the child. I've got something else going on today. So he couldn't die that day. And that was what got him into the doctor. It's like, this is where I was. And he said, well, you know, I can tell you what's going on here. You've got something called depression. Really? There's a name for it? Yeah, and we have things we can do for it. And that was his one attempt, or one time when he was that close. Sometimes people give hints and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's, I'm not going to let anybody find out. I've spoken with another lawyer who survived attempting suicide, who didn't go to church the Sunday before she had decided to die, so that no one would see that she might be distressed. And she did all sorts of things to be a perfectionist and not die. And she had her car in a very remote area, windows taped shut, all kinds of stuff, you know, the exhaust pipe coming into the car, and some hikers wondered about the shiny thing behind some bushes. And they went and found her and pulled the hose out, and she lived. And she said, I have never been so angry in my life as when I woke up in that hospital, because I had failed at even that. So, but now she's way better and a grandmother and thriving. But that's where she had gone. Sometimes it can be stopped. And that's what we're going to talk about. Ask the question. So the more clues you see, the greater the risk. So take all signs seriously. So sometimes people say things directly. I've decided to kill myself. I'm sorry about the PowerPoint jumping forward. It's some weird thing with this that it did this last time and I meant to change it and I forgot. So that's on our end and I apologize. But someone says directly, I've made this decision. I'm going to end it all. If this doesn't happen, that's it. I'm going to do it. That's not terribly common, but it does happen. It's almost like someone's issuing a challenge. And yet you've got to take it seriously. Sometimes it's less direct. I just can't go on. There's no reason to. Who cares? I just want out. I can't deal with this anymore. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. So.
One of the slides that skipped around there was giving away prized possessions. That was something that happened with my brother. I found out later that there were certain items missing that he'd had in his office or in his home. He also, I think, made up stories about people breaking into his home, taking his brand new Apple equipment, all kinds of different things. And I thought anything that he could have sold for money or somebody could have stolen for money. But there were also family things too that went missing. One of the big clues that I had with him in the last several months that we talked was that he said, do you know that perfume bottle that I gave to Mom when I came back from staying in Taipei for a couple of years? And I said, yeah. And he told me about how he smuggled that out of China and he nearly got caught by the authorities and thrown into Mongolian jail. And he said that it was actually an artifact, a relic that would have been destroyed by one of the later dynasties. And he told me what it represented. And I said, Charlie, why are you telling me this? You know, I love the story, but why are you telling me this? And he said, because don't let Mom put that in the garage sale and sell it for a quarter. And I said, no, I would never do that. That's one of the first items that I recovered after my mom died, was that ivory perfume bottle. Mm-hmm. And he had to lie and say that it was whalebone instead of ivory. Mm-hmm. And I took it to a friend of mine who's from China, and she explained what it is and pretty much told me that it looked like it was authentic, not a replication. But he also talked about giving away other things too. Mm-hmm. And it was very odd to me because it seemed to come out of nowhere.
Yeah. And for lawyers, it can be wrapping up a case that has really been dogging you so someone else doesn't have to deal with it. Yeah. That's where that shows up too. Situational, so the kinds of things that might happen to people. And Faith went through some of these. Job issue, relationship issue, loss of freedom, someone getting, we got a call from a lawyer who had a client who was going to be arrested that afternoon for sexual misconduct, exposing themselves or something like that. And they said, I am afraid that they're going to be suicidal because this will hit the paper. And we worked with a lawyer to have some things in place for that client. and the fear of becoming a burden to others, which can happen in older life. So you want to ask, and some things to help with asking someone if they are suicidal is just, don't wait, well, maybe later, I don't know. We cross-examine. We go back in another door if we don't get an answer we want the first time. So be persistent. Try to be private. And make time for them to talk. Have resources handy in terms of who you want them to call. That you ask the question, how you ask the question is exceedingly important. So sometimes it's easier for people to be less direct. And so you can say, have you been really unhappy lately? Or it seems like you've been really unhappy lately. And it seems like you're in a place that I'm worried about you. And have you thought that you wish you could go to sleep or never wake up? And one of the things is, do you feel safe? That's one that's sometimes less direct and easier to answer. More direct is that you might say, sometimes when people are where you are, this is where they go. Are you thinking about suicide? And ask it directly. And if you can't ask, then maybe someone else needs to, and that's okay. But don't ask, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Because then it's about you. You want to be reassured. Don't tell them they're stupid. They're already feeling pretty bad. And so then you listen. This is the persuade part. It's not the problem. It's the unreasonable solution to a perceived insoluble problem. So just offer hope. You don't have to solve it. Listen. And there's some additional things about that in the article that you have. And then ask, will you go with me to get help? Will you let me call someone? And this one now, the contract, will you promise not to do anything until we've gotten some help? I'd like not the contract, but let's make a safety plan. Because some therapists think that there should be contracts. But what is your safety plan? Let's create a safety plan. And then getting someone to someplace. If they're in a particularly bad place, you want to get them to the emergency room. Maybe make sure that they have an appointment set up, and plan for options with what's going on. Since almost all efforts to persuade someone to stay alive will be met with agreement, because someone is listening and someone is there, don't hesitate to get involved. And yet if they still do it, it's not your fault. So say, I want, you're important to me. I want you to live. Who else is involved? Who else can we talk to? Get this network of support around people. And we can help with whatever is, LCL can help with there's issues with getting people to the right services. So if you're going to have that conversation and you want to know what might be available, we can help. Hope helps prevent suicide. So some do's and don'ts. Be direct, listen, express concern, and let them know you care. Don't promise secrecy. I'm going to give you this in a minute because I know you want to talk about this. Don't ignore it. Don't minimize it. Don't impose your own beliefs. You want to talk about that promising secrecy?
It was about a month or two before my brother actually went into the hospital. Last time we saw him was on Thanksgiving of 2007, and he was just released from HCMC that day. And we'd been talking about what to do, but his brain would not allow him to connect up the alcohol problem with all the issues that were going on in his life, with the deterioration of his health. Anyway, he was hospitalized for 3 days. But before that, we had long conversations about what these symptoms might be. And I started asking my medical friends for advice about what could this possibly be, and they told me what they suspected. But when I talked to my brother, he kept insisting that if he went to treatment or if he went to a hospital, that I couldn't tell mom and dad. And he was really more worried about his animals. And I said, I'm more worried about you. And I can figure out other people who can help take care of your animals, but what's important to you is that you get the help that you need, and I'm willing to take you. I'm willing to quit my job. And I didn't tell him that I was willing to keep it secret. I just kind of, let that fly under the radar, because I knew that if he was actually hospitalized somewhere that his insurance didn't cover, or say he went for treatment, that there would probably have to be monies that I didn't have, and I'd probably have to go back and ask my parents for some help on that. And I was willing to do that, and I never said I can't promise you secrecy, but this is one thing that now we're supposed to tell people. Therapists have a duty to do that. As an attorney, if we have a client that says that they're going to kill themselves, we can't promise them that we're going to keep secrecy, because we may have to make an immediate phone call to a law enforcement person or a therapist to save them.
Yeah, 1.14 allows us to take reasonable protective action if we feel that a client is not able to protect themselves. So we are officially at time, but we're going to go a little bit longer because we have a little more to say, but I will understand that if you need to leave, please, do so quietly and look for the information online. The PowerPoint will be posted. There are some resources here for staying well. Take a look at that. Be aware of this 1.14 clients with diminished capacity, because the lawyer shall maintain a normally reasonable client relationship, but the lawyer may take reasonable protective action. So you have an ethical out if you are concerned about that. And we have helped a lot of people talk to their clients and figure out what to do on their clients. We have a comment to the rule on diligence that said it's life balance, handle workloads must be controlled so that each matter can be handled competently. And this path to lawyer well-being has components. Occupational and intellectual are up on top. Those are the things we think are important as lawyers. Down below, we've got other things that, yeah, those are nice, but they're not as important as being a smart lawyer. Emotional, social, physical, and spiritual. But if you look at the diagram, what you're looking at is a boat with our heads in the boat, and we're trying to float on that emotional, social, physical, and spiritual platform. And if there's a hole in our boat, like Charlie's substance use or his physical pain, we aren't thinking right. And so take care of your boat. That's what well-being is about. I'm going to give Faith the final word, but I want to make sure you know about Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. We are a free, confidential resource that helps with any issue that causes stress or distress. We have free counseling available. We have a 24-hour hotline. We have peer support. We have groups like the Wellbeing Group. We have other groups. We have a group for people going through discipline. There's a lot going on. If you're a state or government employee, you probably have an employee assistance program. You can double dip. You can get help through LCL and through your employer. And this is information that connects to the EAP we work with. Many county employees have the same one, so you might be able to see the same counselor. And that's our contact information. So this is a difficult topic, and we tried to cover a lot of information in a relatively short time. I hope this is something that gives you something to think about, something you can use, and to recognize that you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be a person who cares to say to someone else, are you okay? I'm concerned about you. I'd like to hear how you're doing. And remember, in Minnesota, we always ask twice, right? Would you like some coffee? Nope, I'm fine. But really, I just made a fresh pot. It's no trouble. Well, if it's no trouble, that's how we have to do this. Are you okay? I'm fine. Well, let me tell you why I asked, because I'm really concerned about you. Because that second time you ask, they may be ready to change their answer and to take that hand that you're reaching out to give them the help that they need. So Faith, you have shown remarkable courage to come here, and you are doing amazing things to bring this to our profession and talk about how important this is, that we recognize, we talk, we connect, and we are there for each other. So I want to give you the chance to wrap this up and send people on their way to think about this and use that breathing technique we started with.
I've been doing it during the seminar. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for being here. And I gave some of my friends short notice. One thing that I do want to say before I make my final remark is that I think as judges and lawyers and colleagues, we're in a unique position to be able to spot what's going on with people that we know, especially in the legal profession. One of the things that happened shortly before my brother died is that he had some repeat phone calls from certain judges. And most of those judges were here in Ramsey County. And it's because he had some big cases that were scheduled for trial, but he was missing hearings, he was missing pretrials, and he would find somebody to cover for him. And he started getting phone calls from one judge in particular. So the day he died, I picked up his phone and literally went through all the numbers that had called and called people back. So I reached clients, I reached friends, I reached the court system. And what unraveled is that a judge who was scheduled to have him try a case the week after he died, it was a third-degree criminal sex conduct case, had been calling repeatedly and had expressed concern that he kept putting everything off. Well, his client had waived speedy trial, so that wasn't an issue, but he wanted to know, why did so many other people keep making appearances for him? Why did he keep putting off these different hearings? And was there some other issue? And what my brother heard, in his, I think, confused and depressed state, was that this judge was on his case. And he actually complained to my parents and to me about that. And now I know that that particular judge was interested in what was really going on with him and probably didn't know how to have this conversation. So it felt like it was more threatening than helpful. If you have a colleague who asks you to cover for them repeatedly, like these people did for his cases, that's a red flag. You might want to say, are you sick? Is this an ongoing illness? Is this a one-time event? And I think that judges in particular and other court personnel can have the opportunity to invite that person either by phone conference or to come and sit in chambers and to have a one-on-one conversation like Joan described, and to say, I care about you. I care about your well-being. I care about the fact that you have a case here, and I want to know what to do to help you.
We have had judges put us on the phone and leave the room. We're working really hard to tell judges that if they're worried about a lawyer, that they might be the one that saves that life. And so we've been getting more and more calls from judges.
That's good to hear. I'm kind of astonished that somebody would just actually walk out of the room. I think that we all have a responsibility. I mean, that's why I'm here. That's why Joan is here, to have a responsibility to educate ourselves and our peers about the risk of suicide. One of my very good friends and law school classmates lost one of her coworkers again this spring. And I got a text immediately the next morning. Why? He left behind 2 children and a wife. There were no signs. And so she was trying to piece this together because she stood with him every single day and worked on the same cases. And it's confusing and it's frightening. It doesn't have to be. But the one thing I want to say is about suicide, it's permanent. You know, once you're gone, you're gone. I can't bring my brother back. I wish I could at times. I don't think he'd want to be here, not in the state that he was. But I really wish that I would have picked up on more. I wish that other people would have picked up on more. And he made a pretty good job for himself of isolating, you know, his issues and himself enough that people wouldn't see what was happening and wouldn't be able to ask questions, and deflected it. And was very angry and combative at the very end because, again, his disease that told him that he didn't have a disease was protecting itself. So I miss him. I can't bring him back, but we can continue to talk about this and do this in his honor. Thank you.
Thank you.